Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and before we do dive into the main review, I just want to spend a little bit of time addressing the melting power adapter fiasco that has been developing over the last week. We did actually get a few messages asking for our take on this situation, but I guess to be completely honest with you guys, my knowledge of electrics or electrical engineering is just nowhere close to where it would need to be, where I can actually provide some meaningful testing or data. Unfortunately, it's just not my area of expertise. That being said, I have seen the initial report done by Igor's lab, and I also watched the excellent Gamers Nexus video on this topic yesterday, so both of those will be linked down in the description. And right now, it is looking like there's actually different adapters out in the wild, potentially indicating that there's different manufacturers using different internal designs, so maybe some of those are more prone to failure than others, or maybe it was just one bad batch that has a manufacturing defect. Unfortunately, it does just seem like it's too early to tell, and I think Nvidia's silence on the matter also indicates that they are still trying to get to the bottom of this issue. That said, there does seem to be new reports of melting adapters basically every day now over on Reddit, so I personally really do feel that Nvidia needs to get on top of this situation and ideally offer some reassurance or issue a statement, but I have to say I would be surprised if they comment until they have got to the root of the problem. Right now then, my advice is just to be very careful. I don't really want to be a scaremonger, as there really is a whole lot we still don't know, but equally there clearly is a problem with some of these power adapters, we just don't know what it is. If you can use a native 12 volt high power cable, then that is definitely the way to go. And remember, you don't actually need an ATX 3.0 power supply, as some PSU manufacturers are already making 12 volt high power cables for their existing units. If we hear anything else, we will definitely be covering it either in one of my upcoming videos or in news form over on our kitguru.net website. Unfortunately, as unsatisfactory of an answer as it is, right now, we really do just need to wait and see until new information comes to light. Gently putting the power adapter issue to one side then, I do still want to present my review of the ASUS RTX 4090 TUF Gaming OC, simply because I have already tested it. I did test it before all of the power adapter news broke out, and it is actually a very good card, so I think it is worth presenting the data that I have already gathered. It's got a lovely aluminium shroud, there's also dual BIOS support, and a 45 MHz factory overclock, so without wasting time, let's get right into the review. Kicking off with the design of the card then, the ASUS TUF Gaming OC is without a doubt the most premium feeling partner card that I have seen so far, thanks to its incredibly well built aluminium shroud. It honestly makes a massive change from a lot of the rather plasticky cards I've already tested, and it really is a night and day difference versus the Gigabyte Gaming OC. And it's just something I think helps set the TUF Gaming apart from the competition. Of course, the metal shroud does add weight, and the TUF Gaming is the heaviest card I have tested so far, coming in at just over 2.3 kilos on my scales. Taking that into account, ASUS does include a small support beam in the box, which is height adjustable. It is admittedly very basic, but it gets the job done. It doesn't require any screws or assembly, so I can't really complain. As for the overall size of the card then, it measures in at 348.2 by 150 by 72.6 millimeters. That actually means it's the longest RTX 4090 I have tested so far, though it's not quite as thick as the Gaming OC, but it is still over a 3.5 slot design. The size of the card does allow ASUS to include 3 of their Axial Tech fans, and each of these measure 105 millimeters across. ASUS also claims a 23% increase in airflow due to the upscaled size of these fans compared to the prior generation. It's also worth noting that the central fan does spin in reverse relative to the outer two, something we have seen from a number of Gigabyte graphics cards over the last 2 generations, and this simply helps to reduce airflow turbulence, therefore increasing airflow pressure down into the heatsink. We also get a full-length black metal backplate, but with a 10cm cutout towards the end of the card to allow air to flow directly through the heatsink. The dual BIOS switch is also positioned on the back of the card with the choice of either the performance or the quiet BIOS. Now, both of these modes are actually identical in terms of their clock speed and power limits, but the only difference comes in terms of the fan curve, and we will test both of these modes later in the review. There's a touch of RGB lighting on the card too, with the TUF logo and a small LED strip on the side of the card lighting up once powered on. This is quite a low-key approach, so if you really love RGB, then it may not be for you, but equally this could be exactly what you are looking for. After all, it is just personal preference. Another unique part of the design then comes when looking at the display outputs, as we actually have a total of 5. So there's 2 HDMI 2.1 and then 3 DisplayPort 1.4. Now you can still only use a maximum of 4 at any one time, but I still think it's a nice touch and it gives you that added flexibility to have the extra HDMI 2.1 port, which may be useful depending on your monitor and TV setup. Moving on to take the card apart then, before we do take a look at the PCB, I just want to point out a couple of nice touches on ASUS's behalf that do make life that bit easier if you do want to disassemble the card. First of all, the aluminium shroud can actually be removed from the card without unscrewing the heatsink. So this simply means if one of the fans breaks and you need to change it, you don't actually have to take the card completely apart just to get to the shroud. So in my perspective, that is a consumer-friendly move from ASUS. ASUS is also using small latches on the fan and RGB headers, something I absolutely love to see, and it's surprisingly rare. Many times you actually have to be careful with these headers as they use kind of tiny locking mechanisms, and if you're not careful, you can end up pulling the entire plastic header off from the PCB. With the TUF Gaming OC then, you simply need to release the small clip and the header will pull free. So again, a small touch, but it does make life easier. As for the PCB itself then, the first thing to note is actually how short it is compared to the card's total length. I actually measured the shroud extending past the PCB by about 13 centimeters. With that said, we can see that ASUS is using an 18-phase VRM for the GPU with 70 amp Infineon TDA 21570 MOSFETs, while the memory VRM is 4-phase, this time using 50 amp Vishay SiC 639 MOSFETs. A monolithic Power Systems MP28888A controller is used for the GPU VRM, and there's a UPI UP9512 controlling the memory VRM. As for the cooler, this is another vapor chamber design with a shared base plate that contacts both the GPU and the memory modules, and this sits on top of 8 heat pipes, 5 measuring 8mm thick and 3 measuring 6mm thick. One thing I did notice, however, about the cooler is in regard to the width of the thermal pads. Basically, I was just actually taking a look at the PCB and I noticed it seemed like for the 4 memory modules on the right of the GPU, they didn't appear to be completely covered by the thermal pad, as the thermal pad imprint didn't extend all the way to the edges of the modules themselves. Sure enough, the thermal pad used to contact those 4 memory modules is actually visibly narrower than the one on the other side, and you may be able to tell just by looking at this B-roll clip. But I did also get my digital caliper out and I found that the pad on the left side measures about 13mm wide compared to just over 11mm for the one on the other side. To be clear, I'm not saying this is a massive issue, though we will take a look at memory thermals later in the video. I'm just not really sure why ASUS wouldn't use 2 thermal pads of the same width just to make sure that the memory modules themselves are completely covered, but there we go, it's just something I noticed and I wanted to point it out. The final thing to say then is we can also see that thermal pads are used on the underside of the backplate just to help draw out a bit of extra heat from the back of the memory modules as well as the VRM. Moving on then to our testing of the card itself. For this, we are of course using our regular GPU test system for 2022, and this is powered by MSI. This uses an Intel i9-12900K CPU paired with the MSI Meg Z690 Unify motherboard, and we also have 32GB of ADATA XPG Lancer DDR5 memory clocked at 6000 MHz. For all of our testing, a MSI MPG321UR QD 4K monitor was used. Kicking off with our thermal performance then, here we are testing both the performance and the quiet BIOS. As expected, the performance BIOS runs the coolest of the two, and it does deliver good results, with a peak GPU temperature of 65.2 degrees, though the hotspot result is more middling with a peak of 78.3 degrees. The quiet BIOS does run a fair bit warmer even than the Nvidia Founders Edition, but as we shall see, it is significantly quieter. As for memory thermals then, it has to be said the TUF Gaming is quite middle of the road. I really was hoping for slightly better, until that is, I disassembled the card. We can see a peak of just 74 degrees using the performance BIOS, and that is well within safe limits. It's not going to cause any problems. And even the quiet BIOS peak reading of 82 degrees is still cooler than Nvidia's Founders Edition. That being said, compared to the likes of the Inno3D X3 OC, and particularly the Gigabyte Gaming OC, the TUF Gaming does lag behind somewhat, and I wonder just how much of this is part to the thermal pads not fully covering the memory modules. Thankfully though, noise levels are very competitive. The performance BIOS is of course the loudest of the two, with the fans ramping up to 1620 RPM, producing 39 decibels of noise. The quiet BIOS, however, drops fan speed significantly, down to just 1210 RPM, and that actually produced the lowest amount of fan noise for any RTX 4090 we have tested so far, hitting just 34 decibels on our sound meter. As for noise-normalised thermals, here we increased the fan speed up to 1780 RPM to hit 40 decibels. This saw the TUF Gaming come in at just over 64 degrees on the GPU, so it's a couple of degrees cooler than the Gigabyte Gaming OC, and not much hotter at all than the Inno3D X3 OC. That said, the Palette GameOC OC continues to impress, and it actually gives the best results of any air-cooled card that I've tested so far. As for power draw, this is also as expected, considering the TUF Gaming operates with a 450 watt power limit out of the box. Of all the 4090s I've tested, only the MSI Supreme Liquid X has actually increased the power limit out of the box. Because of that, clock speed behaviour is very similar to the other 4090s, with the performance BIOS averaging 2760 MHz over our 30-minute stress test, while the quiet BIOS averaged 2738 MHz due to its slightly higher operating temperatures, which does affect the dynamic boost algorithm. Keeping that clock speed information in mind, it's honestly not a surprise to see gaming performance is basically the same as every other 4090 we've tested. The TUF Gaming was never more than 1% faster than the Founders Edition over the 5 games we tested, though that is still not a bad thing, as we know the RTX 4090 can churn out incredibly high frame rates. Just don't expect a huge leap forward compared to the Founders. The good news for overclocking enthusiasts though is that the TUF Gaming does actually allow you to increase the power limit all the way up to 600 watts, so it gives you that 33% power limit increase using something like MSI Afterburner. My best result came when adding 200 MHz to the GPU core and 1675 MHz to the GDDR6X memory. This saw the average operating clock speed increase up to 2955 MHz, and in some games tested it could hit closer to 3 GHz. That led to relatively decent gains in the titles we retested, with performance increases in the 6 to 8% region, though that is exactly what we've come to expect from overclocking the 4090 as a whole. Overall then, there is a lot to like about the ASUS RTX 4090 TUF Gaming OC, and I'd have to say it's definitely up there as one of my favourite AIB cards that we have tested so far. A large part of this is undoubtedly down to the aluminium shroud. In my opinion, a lot of RTX 4090s just don't live up to the premium feel that you'd expect considering the price point, but the TUF Gaming absolutely nails this and is right up there with the Founders Edition in terms of the premium build quality. Cooling performance as well is very solid, it's impressive out of the box, and while it can't quite match the Palette GameRock OC in terms of the noise-normalised thermals, it's not far off. The out-of-the-box memory temperatures though weren't quite as good as I was expecting, especially having just tested the Gigabyte Gaming OC. As we showed earlier in the video, it's possible that at least part of this is due to the use of a narrow thermal pad, which doesn't fully cover some of the memory modules. But that being said, the temperatures are still well within safe limits, so I wouldn't say it was a major concern, just something for ASUS to improve on next time. Factoring in the dual BIOS as well, with the quiet mode producing the lowest noise levels of any RTX 4090 we have tested so far, and clearly there is a lot to like here with the ASUS TUF Gaming OC, and it really doesn't have any major weaknesses. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for this video, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts on this card and the power adapter situation as a whole down in the comments. You can also subscribe if you haven't already and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out when we upload, and why not come chat with us on our Discord server, which is linked in the description below. While you're there, you can also find a link to our merch store, and if you're feeling particularly generous, you could even consider backing us on Patreon. That's it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.